If you have experienced the devastation of divorce or felt the overwhelming grief due to the death of a spouse, be encouraged. There's hope, healing, and help on the other side of the heartache. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
It takes many hands to build a healthy life. Recovery from mental and substance use disorders is possible with the support of my community. Join the Voices for Recovery. Visible, vocal, valuable.
For confidential information on mental and substance use disorders, including prevention and treatment referral for you or someone you know, call 1-800-662-HELP. Brought to you by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
Going through a divorce can be a very difficult, life-changing event. There's so many emotions and feelings wrapped up in it. Feelings of guilt, anger, sadness, grief, fear. Also, the death of a spouse is a very traumatic experience. It can turn your world upside down. But there is hope and healing and help on the other side, and there is forgiveness on the other side as well. In a previous show, we promised you that we would share with you our story as we invite other couples to come on and share their stories. I've shared I've shared information with you about my story, and this evening we're going to talk to Mel about his story. I'm Voncille Greene, and this is my husband, Melvin Greene. Welcome to Living a Godly Marriage.
Hello, Voncille. How are you?
Hello.
Okay.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I was born and raised in Baltimore, and once I graduated from high school, I went to the University of Maryland, where I got my bachelor's degree many years ago. And then I went to Howard University and got my master's degree. And afterwards, I married my college sweetheart from the University of Maryland.
So, after you married your high school sweetheart or your college sweetheart, how long did that marriage last?
Well, that marriage actually lasted 22 years. We got married, and we both thought it'd be kind of happily ever after. But over the years, things sort of impacted the marriage. Reflecting back on it, a few years into the marriage, my wife got pregnant, and we were all excited about that. But unfortunately, that ended up with a stillborn birth.
Yes.
So my wife went through the birthing process, but unfortunately the baby had died before being born. Yeah. And that impacted the marriage. There was a lot of grief over that. I remember my wife questioning, I wish I would, I could, or should. And it took a while for that healing to take place.
Yes.
Fortunately, a couple years later, the Lord blessed us with a child. But as years went on in the marriage, we sort of drifted apart. We both had successful careers and were spending a lot of time on that. And we didn't really know God's blueprints about marriage. We didn't have any premarital counseling. And so we were trying to heal and trying to build, but we really didn't have God's blueprints. So it was like we were spinning our wheels. And over time, again, we got further and further apart.
So before your marriage ended, did you seek counseling at all?
Yeah, there came a point where we went to our pastor for counseling. He talked to us in that session together. Then he talked to us apart. and then he brought us back together, and he gave us homework assignments, and he assured us that he would continue to counsel us and help us overcome the difficulties we were having. Well, that raised my hopes and expectations, but on the way home that night, my wife said she wasn't going back to counseling anymore. And a couple weeks later, I received a letter from her attorney as she was seeking divorce. And
how did you feel about that when she told you that she was throwing in the towel? And
well, I was surprised and disappointed because, again, when I got married, I thought it'd be for a lifetime. We were both Christians, and we know in the Bible in Malachi it says God hates divorce.
Right.
And so I was willing to really work it out, even though, again, I had made some mistakes, and I knew certainly wasn't loving her as Christ loved the church. And I knew I had some growing to do and some learning to do, but I was really disappointed that she didn't want to make that same commitment to keep us together.
Yes, and so you ultimately divorced.
Yes, in 1998, after 22 years of marriage, we divorced. And again, that was a little challenging. The following year, our daughter graduated from high school and moved to New York to go to college and ultimately to live in New York City. And after about 18 months, I started dating again and got remarried in 2001.
And how did that go?
Well, that was interesting because I was introduced to a blended family because my wife at that time had a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old. So now I became kind of instant dad, and the 6-year-old was just glad to have a father, and I mean, the love there and reception there was great. The 10-year-old, it was a little different story because it was a challenge for her because she had problems with her biological father.
Yes.
So we did go to counseling, and the counselor helped us to work through those issues. But again, no premarital counseling. We were starting to learn how to build the marriage God's way, how to make it work God's way. And so that marriage was pretty good.
Okay, now did you go to counseling before you married your second wife?
No, again, very little counseling. But what we decided to do was to learn more about marriage, and so we went to seminars and conferences dealing with Christian marriage. And it did help me to learn how to be a better husband, and it also helped her how to be a better wife.
Great. And so you were married to your second wife how many years?
Well, we were married for 8 years. Again, I got married in 2001,
Right.
and then during the summer of 2009, the four of us went on a cruise, and I mean, it was a great experience. We just really loved it, and but next to the last day of the cruise, my wife got a little sick, and when we got home, she got a little worse. Now, and this goes back to when we first got married and went on our honeymoon. We were in the air flying down to Florida to go on a cruise, and we discovered she needed oxygen.
Oh.
And so that was our coming back from our honeymoon. That was our last plane ride. And so for those 8 years, I really became like her caregiver.
Yes.
She used oxygen. She had congestive heart failure. It was getting worse, progressively worse, and it became much more serious than both of us realized. So a week after we got back from our cruise, she unexpectedly passed.
That must have been devastating.
It
for
was
you.
devastating because we had a good marriage, and I had a senior in high school, one of my daughters, and the other was a senior in college. But fortunately, a couple years earlier, we had done some remodeling in our basement, and my in-laws who lived in Upper Michigan would come down. They came down a couple winters and stayed with us because they were in their 80s and it's really cold in Upper Michigan. So we welcomed them, and I built a good relationship with them. And so within a couple of days after she passed, they called and asked if they could come and live with us. Again, they knew that I had a senior in high school and a senior in college, so we certainly welcomed them. And so their son drove their van down from Michigan, and they stayed with us for the winter.
Yes, you said you had a great relationship with your second wife's
Yes,
parents.
yes,
Yes,
yes, my in-laws.
yes.
And we will see a little later, my mother-in-law had a really important part in the story as it continues.
Yes. Now, how did your daughters, your stepdaughters, they're your daughters, how did they adjust to the death of their mother? And
It impacted both of them. It helped to have their grandparents there because that kind of cushioned the blow emotionally, and it also helped me out a lot. And I sort of dedicated myself to being their dad, sometimes their dad and mom, and to help them make the transition after the death of their mother.
Yeah.
And that was again in August of 2009.
okay, and so after the death of their mother, how soon was it after that you started to think about dating again, getting out there?
Well, that's an interesting question because again, my whole effort at that point was fathering them, taking care of them, making sure they were okay, and so I remember the younger one coming to me one day and said, "Dad, it's time for you to start dating. You've been taking care of us, but she's back in school now, and you need to get out there." So I joined eHarmony, and both daughters would say, I like this one, you ought to give her a call, and I like that one, you ought to give her a call. And but also what really helped me, I took a course at my church, Reed Temple, and it was called Grief Share. And what it did was to help my healing and help me to deal with the grief. In fact, I liked the course so much that the next time it was given, I co-facilitated it. And that really expedited my healing. So I was ready to go back on the dating scene.
So wonderful. So we're going to talk more about that when we come back in just a few minutes. Welcome back to the show. We're talking with Melvin about his story. He shared with us his experience in his first marriage that ended in divorce, and also his second marriage that ended due to the death of his spouse. He's also shared with us that at the encouragement of his daughters and his brother-in-law, really, he did eventually get back out there in the dating scene again.
Yes, yes, I did. But that was the fall of 2009.
Yes.
And as I mentioned, my in-laws were living with us at that time, and they used to drive their van every Sunday to the church they used to attend in Washington, D.C. That was the winter of the big snowstorms,
Right.
the winter of 2009. And I overheard them talking one day and saying how difficult it was to keep dealing with the snow and driving to church. So I met with them and I said that I was going to temporarily leave my church, Reed Temple, and drive them every Sunday to their church. So I started doing that, and I would have to go early because my mother-in-law sang in a choir, and the choir rehearsed about an hour before service.
That's right.
So I was just sitting there talking with my father-in-law every Sunday. And after about 3 weeks, my mother-in-law says, well, why don't you come and join the choir and you could sing with us? Well, I had sung in other churches, and so I agreed to do that. And so as I joined the choir, one thing that she did that turned out to be special in my life was she introduced me to you.
The lucky you.
Yeah.
I do remember the day that you first came to our church. I was coming into the fellowship room, and as I was coming in, you were walking out. I had no idea who you were. You had quite a bit of hair then, a bush. But I heard clearly that's your husband. And God talks to us all the time. And sometimes we listen and sometimes we don't. I heard it as clear as day, but I pushed it down. I didn't acknowledge it. I just thought it was very strange. Where did that come from? So I just sort of pushed it down and did not think about it anymore until there was a wonderful woman at our church, Dr. Betty Bowie Yates, who would sponsor a missions trip to South Africa every year. And I was invited to go on a trip with them. And as I used a wheelchair, she was looking for someone to assist me while we were over in South Africa. And you volunteered to do it. Correct?
Yeah, I volunteered to do it because, again, as a caregiver for my wife, I was pushing her around in a wheelchair, helping her with a walker. And so it was not new to me.
Right.
And since we had been singing together for a few months at that point in the choir, though there was really no romantic interest,
Right.
I just thought it'd be a good thing to do to help my fellow choir member.
And I thought it was a wonderful thing. I thought, what man or a man would volunteer to go to South Africa and help a woman in a wheelchair that he really does not know, except for us singing in the choir together. But as it turns out, you were not able to make that trip due to a work commitment. But that's what got him on my radar screen, because all the time that I was over there, the entire 2 weeks or so, I kept thinking about this man who wanted to push me around in my wheelchair. And I also thought it's a good thing that he wasn't able to go on this trip, because as it turned out, there were a lot of his former colleagues who were on that trip, single women, and I thought, wow, I may not have had a chance with this guy. But
In the meantime, while you were taking this trip and as the weeks were going by, something interesting was happening during my trips to and from church, bringing my in-laws. I started to notice that every Sunday my mother-in-law would say, Voncille's a nice girl, and Voncille is nice, and Voncille does this, and Voncille does that. And I was starting to get a little suspicious. She asked me, have you talked to Voncille? And I really hadn't done that. But then one Sunday, they were sitting in the back seat of the van, and I was driving them home, and I heard her doing her normal accolades about you. And she asked her husband, isn't she a nice girl? And I saw in the rearview mirror, she elbowed him, and he said, yeah, she's a nice girl. And so I said, something is up. Something is up. But turns out she was right. She knew. And so when you came back from your trip, what happened then?
well, I did call you because I wanted to thank you, because I learned that you also made a financial contribution towards the trip. So I called you up to get your address so that I could write you a thank you note. And we had a conversation then. But it's really interesting, after that phone call, still I had no romantic feelings towards you. Except for the time, well, I don't know if they were romantic feelings, but I did have thoughts about you and why you would want to help me. But there were no romantic feelings. And then one day, out of the clear blue, I was sitting in my normal chair at the church, and he walks over and says,
Well, what had happened was after church service, there would always be a fellowship, and people would come together in a room, and we'd have pastries and a little bit of food. But I could never really talk to you because there were always people around you talking to you. And so finally, at this one point, I said to you, you know, I've been trying to talk to you, but I can't talk to you because people are always around. I said, the only way I could get to talk to you is to take you out. And you said,
take me out, and you said yes, and I said to dinner out because I love to eat. And you said yes to
Yes.
dinner out, and so that was that. And so he would call me on the phone, and we would talk. And there was this one particular night he calls, and we talked for a long time, and I was sure that that would be the night that he would ask me out. But he said, well, I'll see you on Sunday, and he hung up the phone, and I'm like, well, you know, what's going on here? And I had said to a niece of mine that this gentleman at church said that he wanted to take me out, but I was not going to pursue it any further. You know, if he asked me out, fine. If not, fine. But I would say nothing more about it. And then one Sunday he comes over and he talks to me the next Sunday, and he's walking away, and I heard this voice. I don't know where it came from, except for I heard this voice say, hey, what about dinner? And he stopped and turned around and said,
yes. I did say I was going to take you to dinner. Well, if that's what I said, that's what I'm going to do.
yes.
And so a couple weeks later, I did take you to dinner. And how was that first date?
It was magical. He asked where I wanted to go, and I suggested that he choose a place because I wanted to find out what kind of taste he had. And so he chose a place that I'd been to 100 times that I didn't particularly want to go to. But that night, everything was beautiful. The music was beautiful. The voices were lively and beautiful and sweet, and just everything looked great. It was just magical.
Yeah, it was magical to me as well. And that was the first inclination because when I started dating, I remember praying and saying, God is still not good for man to be alone. Please help me to find a wife.
Yes.
And that night I started to feel like, Lord, you're showing me something. My only, and it was a magical, as you said, evening, and enjoyed your company. And we started dating and courting. And interestingly enough, my only concern was being a caregiver again.
Right.
And again, I prayed and talked to the Lord about that. And first of all, he showed me it would be easier than caregiving the last time, and that you were really pretty independent on your own.
Yes.
And from everything from transportation to going back and forth to work on Capitol Hill. And so he just started knitting our hearts together, and I really felt that was an answer to prayer. Now, had you been praying as well?
Oh, absolutely. And I think I shared in a previous show that I was dating guys that were not particularly good for me. Not that they were bad guys, but were not good for me. And so one day I just finally said, I'm not going to do this anymore. And I was very busy in my community, so I wasn't looking for someone to marry. But I was interested in dating. But I just woke up and I said, I'm not going to do this anymore. And I started praying to God to send me the man that he wanted me to have, because I was not going to go down those roads anymore. And in 2009, my ex-husband passed away. And I went to his funeral, and I remember coming home, and I was feeling very sad and didn't quite know where to put the grief, but I was feeling very sad and started recalling some things that he had said to me about not finding another man to love me the way that he did. And so I went over to my desk and I looked out the window and I saw the most brilliant rainbow that you ever want to see. I couldn't leave it. I wanted to take a picture of it, but I couldn't leave the rainbow. And I felt that God was telling me, there is someone, I do have someone for you. Just keep the faith and hold on, that it will manifest. And so I just took that as a message that everything was going to be okay.
Right.
And sometimes when, you know, God promise you something and he does it in such a way that there's absolutely no question about whether or not God was in the details. Because during my time of praying for a man and meeting the man that God set aside for me, I got very sick. Somehow I contracted bacterial meningitis and it left me severely disabled. But even with that, I kept believing and trusting God that he was going to do what I felt in my heart that he would promise me that he would do. Mm-hmm. Send me a man that he wanted me to have.
Right. But I think, again, we both were praying and asking God for someone. And so what did God do? He sent a man from Maryland to meet a woman from Virginia in a church in Washington, D.C. Only God. And so one year to the date after that first magical date, we got married.
Yes, and you know, I think it's important to share with people that the first time I saw him in that room, when I heard that that's your husband, that is the room that Melvin proposed to me in, and he had no idea. I had not shared with him what I had heard that day when I first saw the back of his head, but that was the room that you proposed to me in, and I knew that you know, you were absolutely the man that God had sent to me.
Right. Yes, and so we started. We got married. You joined Reed Temple, where I was going to church. We started teaching marriage classes at the church. We started serving in preparing for ministry God's way, helping engage couples. Mm-hmm. And now as an extension of our ministry, we're doing this show. Yes. So God knew what he was doing.
Right.
And it didn't matter what our past was. We held on to God's unchanging hand. He brought us together. He answered our prayer, and now we're serving him.
Yes. And so there's so much more to the story that we would like to share with you. But our time is up, and we would love for you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And
you can also email us at livingagodlymarriage@gmail.com. And we look forward to getting your questions, comments, topics that you want to hear from us on future shows. As we conclude, we want you to remember that living a godly marriage is the best marriage.
Bye-bye.
National Prevention Week is a celebration of all the things that happen all year long.
Prevention is at the core. It's mental health, physical health.
Some of our National Prevention Week activities have been focusing on the illegal drugs, illegal use of opioids.
Drugs, alcohol, mental health, suicide,
Underage drinking, tobacco use.
Prevention is about saving lives.
This is where it happens.
This is Prevention at Work.
Without the letters A, B, and O, There's no mom. There's no Brittany. Because A's, B's, and O's determine your blood type. And we're missing all of them. Schedule your donation at redcrossblood.org.